They came at night, two men in black shirts with big white letters, HOA. They didn't knock like neighbors. They pounded like cops, and when I opened the door, they didn't ask questions. They walked straight to my garage and started smashing it apart, glass breaking, metal bending, my heart racing. But then, from inside the house, my son heard it. And what he did next changed everything. Welcome back to HOA Secrets, where every week we bring you the darkest and wildest stories from behind the white fences of suburbia. My name is Daniel. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Texas. I work a regular job, pay my bills, cut my lawn like everyone else. But if you live under an HOA, you know one thing is always true. It's never really quiet. And the night those men showed up at my door, I learned just how far the wrong kind of HOA will go. That night felt wrong from the start. The air was still. No dogs barking. No cars driving by. Just silence. And then the pounding on the door began. I froze in the hallway. It wasn't a knock. It was heavy. Like someone trying to break in. My wife whispered from the kitchen, asking who it was, but I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Two men stood outside. Black shirts. Bold white letters across the chest. HOA. They looked official, but not in the normal way. No clipboards, no paperwork, just bats in their hands. Their eyes were cold, like they weren't here to talk. I cracked the door open. One of them stepped forward, boots crunching on my porch. He said I was in violation. He said the board sent them. He said the garage was bringing down the value of the neighborhood. I wanted to laugh, because this wasn't how HOA worked. But the way he stared at me made me forget to laugh before I could say a word. The second man pushed past me, straight to the garage. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the night, and just like that, my quiet neighborhood wasn't to quiet anymore. I ran after them, yelling, asking who sent them, but they didn't care. One of them swung his bat against the side window. Another slammed it into the garage door until the metal bent inward. The noise was violent, wrong, and it carried through the whole street. Lights started turning on in the houses around us, but no one came out. Inside the house, my son was watching from the window. He was 13, still a kid, but not really a kid anymore. He had been obsessed with survival videos, armor, tactics, weapons. I always thought it was harmless, just YouTube stuff. But that night, he thought it was real. I heard his bedroom door slam upstairs. I thought he was hiding, but I was wrong. Moments later, the front door burst open, and there he was, wearing that old green vest he bought from a yard sale, shoulders tight, jaw locked, eyes wide, in his hands. The black rifle that looked too real in the dark. The men froze. The bats lowered just a little. For the first time, they didn't look so brave. My son shouted words. I never expected to hear from him. Back off, or I shoot. His voice cracked, but it was still louder than mine ever was. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to grab him, pull him back inside, tell him it wasn't a game, but he stood firm. And for a moment, even I believed he would pull the trigger. The men hesitated. They looked at each other. Maybe realizing this house wasn't the easy target they wanted. Maybe realizing a kid with nothing to lose is scarier than a man with rules. The bats dropped to the driveway. The sound was sharp, final. They stepped back slowly, hands up like they were the victims now. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Porch lights flickered on and off. But still, no one came closer. It was just us, my family, my boy, and two men who had thought they owned the night. I wanted to breathe, but the silence after the chaos was heavier than the chaos itself. And she saw it in that silence. I saw it clearly. The letters on their shirts weren't even printed right. The fabric looked cheap. The stitching crooked. This wasn't the real HOA. This was something darker. My son didn't lower the rifle. His hands shook, but his aim was steady. The men kept backing away, step by step, until the street swallowed them in shadow. Then, the sirens began. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the block, and my neighbors finally opened their doors. The world came rushing back. But my heart was still racing. Later, I would find out the truth, that these men weren't board members. Not even neighbors, they were imposters, scammers who moved from street to street, pretending to be HOA enforcers, smashing garages, demanding cash, preying on fear. But in that moment, standing in the wreckage of my garage, watching my son lower the rifle, I couldn't stop asking myself one question: how far would they have gone? If he hadn't come out, the police cars rolled in fast, lights spinning, sirens screaming down the quiet street. Neighbors who had been hiding suddenly came outside, phones in their hands, whispers in their mouths. And I stood there on the driveway, next to my son, next to the smashed glass and bent metal of my garage. The officers jumped out, hands on their belts. One of them shouted at my boy, "Drop the weapon." And for a second, I thought my son was going to be the one in danger. I raised my arms, yelling it was just an airsoft rifle, telling them he was only 13. But the way they looked at him, they weren't sure, because in the flashing lights, that gun looked real enough to end lives. I stepped in front of him, begging him to put it down. My son's face was pale, his hands shaking now. He lowered the rifle slowly, like every second weighed 100 pounds, and when it touched the driveway, I swear the whole street sighed in relief. The police rushed forward. They checked the garage, searched the street, but the men were gone, vanished into the night. All that was left were the bats they dropped, and the damage they left behind. I told the officers everything. How they claimed to be HOA, how they smashed the garage, how my son stood his ground. But the officer shook his head, said it wasn't the first time he had heard of fake HOA, said some groups were moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, preying on fear, pretending to have authority, and most people handed over cash to make them leave. But we hadn't. We fought back, or at least, my son did. The officers promised to investigate. They took statements. They took the bats. They even took photos of my garage. But as they left, I could see it in their faces. They didn't think they'd catch them. They didn't think it was important enough. That night, after the lights faded and the neighbors went back inside, I sat in the living room with my son, the rifle back in the closet, the vest on the floor. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the wall, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. I wanted to scold him, tell him how dangerous it was. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he had saved us. The next morning, things got stranger. A letter was taped to my front door. No envelope, just one piece of paper. The words were bold, black marker across white. "You're lucky your boy was brave. Next time, it won't save you." I read it 3 times before I let my wife see it. She gasped. She wanted to call the police again, but I didn't, because I knew what they would say. No fingerprints, no suspects, no proof, just another piece of paper in a case no one cared about. But I cared, because now, it wasn't just about my garage, it was about my family, and the line had been crossed that evening. I walked down the street. Neighbors stopped me, asked questions. Some whispered about my son, calling him a hero. Others whispered louder, saying we were reckless. One woman said a 13-year-old should never hold a gun, even if it was fake. Another man said it was about time someone stood up to bullies. Everyone had an opinion, but none of them had a solution. I felt the weight of the letter in my pocket. The threat burned hotter than the smashed glass still scattered across my driveway. And that's when I realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stayed awake late that night, watching the window, waiting for headlights that never came. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every creak of the house made me think they were back. But they didn't return. Not that night. Not the next. Not for a week. Still, I felt them watching. The way the bushes rustled when no wind blew. The way a car slowed down near my house but never stopped. The way my son jumped at every noise. Something had shifted in our lives. The HOA, real or fake, was now a shadow that followed us everywhere. And then, 1 week later, the real HOA showed up, clipboards in hand, smiles that weren't smiles at all. They said they had received complaints about the state of my garage, about the damage still not repaired, about the noise that night disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. I almost laughed in their faces. 2 men had smashed my property pretending to be them, and instead of help, the real HOA wanted fines. I looked at them, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt anger, hot, sharp, burning anger. Because if the fake HOA didn't ruin us, The real one was sure trying. The clipboard in his hands shook slightly, but not from fear. It was the kind of shake that comes from anger held in, from authority that isn't questioned often enough. He cleared his throat and told me the fines would start immediately: $200 for visual disorder, $300 for community disruption, and $50 for every day the garage wasn't repaired. I stared at him in disbelief. My garage hadn't been destroyed by me. It was their so-called authority, their image, that allowed imposters to walk onto my property. But he didn't care. His smile never reached his eyes. His words were cold, rehearsed, like he had said the same thing to dozens of neighbors before me. My wife begged me under her breath, "Don't fight them. Just pay. Just get it over with." But I couldn't. Something inside me had snapped the night those bats crashed against my walls, and the letter they left behind. It was still folded in my pocket like a wound that wouldn't heal. I told the board member I wasn't paying. I told him he should be helping, not punishing. His smile dropped, his eyes hardened, and he scribbled something on the clipboard. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, but he left me with 7 words that cut sharper than glass. "You'll regret this more than you think." The week that followed was war, not with bats this time, but with paper, with rules, with the petty power of people who believe they own the world because they own a title. First came the letters, one every morning in my mailbox. Violation notices for things that weren't violations at all. My lawn too short one day, too long the next. My trash bins too close to the curb, then too far from it. My mailbox painted the wrong shade of white. They fined me for a flower pot, for a cracked driveway stone, for the way my curtains looked from the street. It was madness. It was deliberate. My neighbors watched silently. Some whispered when I walked past. Others avoided my eyes completely, but I could feel it. The board was turning them against me, making me look like the problem, like the outlaw of the cul-de-sac. One night, as I dragged another violation letter inside, I saw movement across the street. 2 figures in black shirts leaned against a car, the fake HOA, watching. I froze at the window. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but the bold white letters on their shirts glowed under the street lamp. They didn't approach. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching, and then drove away slowly, leaving me shaking in my own living room. The real HOA sent more letters. The fake HOA left more shadows, and I was stuck between 2 enemies wearing the same name. My son grew restless. He asked me why no one believed us. He asked why the real HOA didn't care that imposters were running wild, and I didn't have an answer. All I could tell him was the truth, that sometimes the only difference between real power and fake power is the logo on a piece of paper. Days turned to weeks. The fines piled higher than I could count. My wife begged me again to pay, to make peace, to end it. But how do you make peace with people who don't want peace? How do you pay off a monster that feeds on your fear? I decided to fight, not with guns, not with fists, but with their own weapons. I read the rule book cover to cover, every page, every line, every contradiction, and I found it. The one rule they had broken themselves, the board president. The one who smiled, but never really smiled. Her mailbox was 2 inches shorter than the regulations allowed. 2 inches. And in the world of HOA, 2 inches is enough to bring down an empire. The next meeting, I showed up with photos. I showed up with measurements. I showed up with the rulebook highlighted in yellow. The neighbors gasped. The president's face flushed red. The board tried to silence me, but the evidence was too clear. For the first time, they were on the defensive. But victory didn't taste sweet, because when I left that meeting, a car followed me home. Dark, slow, headlights low, and when I pulled into my driveway, the car stopped at the corner. The window rolled down, and a voice I recognized whispered across the night, "You think this is over?" The car drove off, but the words stayed. They echoed in my chest like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The next morning, another letter waited for me. Not from the real HOA this time, from the fake one. And this one was different. It wasn't just a threat. It was personal. "We know your son. We know what school he goes to. Keep pushing, and we'll visit him next." I dropped the paper. My hands shook. My wife's scream filled the kitchen when Sapissad. He read it, My son's face went pale. The fight wasn't just about the garage anymore. It wasn't about fines or violations. It was about safety, about family, about survival. I wanted to run, pack up, leave the neighborhood behind. But where do you run when the people chasing you wear the same letters as the ones in charge? Where do you go when the rules that protect you are the same rules they use to destroy you? I stayed awake that night with the lights on. Every sound outside made me reach for the phone. Every shadow made me wonder if it was them. And in the middle of that silence, one thought kept haunting me. What if the fake HOA and the real HOA weren't so different? What if they weren't enemies at all? What if they were working together? Because who else would know the exact details of my violations? Who else would know how to break me down piece by piece? Who else would know where my son went to school? I stared at the window. The blinds opened just enough to see the street, and I asked myself the question I couldn't answer. Had I been fighting two enemies all along? Or was it really just one wearing two masks? I couldn't sleep that night. The letter about my son sat on the table. Like a gun no one had fired yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words again. We know your son. We know what school he goes to. My wife begged me to call the police. But what would I say? That the same HOA who fined me for flower pots was threatening my boy? They'd laugh, or worse. They'd shrug and tell me to keep paying, so I stayed awake, sitting by the window, waiting for headlights that never came. And as the hours dragged on, I realized something. I wasn't going to win by running. I wasn't going to win by hiding. I had to fight back, but not with fists, not with guns. I had to fight with the only thing the HOA cared about more than power: rules. The next morning, I started small. I printed every violate, and they sent me, stacked them into a neat pile. I read every line of their handbook again, and I noticed something most people missed. The rules weren't designed to protect the neighborhood. They were designed to protect the board. Every fine was money for them. Every regulation was leverage. But what happens when you follow every rule so perfectly that it traps them instead? That became my plan. Revenge by compliance. I painted my house the exact shade allowed by their code. Down to the paint brand and number, I measured my mailbox height twice a day. Making sure it was exactly where the rule book demanded, I cut my grass to the inch, sometimes trimming with scissors just so it couldn't be called too high or too low. I even replaced the cracked stone on my driveway with one that was measured, photographed, and stamped with proof of purchase. Every time they sent me a violation, I sent back proof that I had fixed it, and not just proof, but receipts, photos, and even signed witness notes from neighbors. I buried them in their own paperwork. The fines stopped because they couldn't stick, but the letters didn't stop. The threats didn't stop. The fake HOA kept watching. One night I found a black shirt tossed on my lawn, torn across the chest, letters peeling. It felt like a warning, like they wanted me to know they were still there, and maybe, just maybe, closer than I thought. But I didn't stop, because every rule I followed became a chain around their neck, and little by little, I could feel them losing control at the next HOA meeting. I showed up with a binder, 3 inches thick, filled with photos, receipts, measurements, and proof. I laid it on the table in front of the board. The sound it made was louder than any bat hitting my garage. Neighbors leaned in, curious. The president's smile faltered. I told them I had followed every rule, perfectly, that I was in compliance in ways they didn't even think of, and that if they fined me again, I would take them to court, not just for harassment, but for fraud. The room went quiet. Even the neighbors who usually sided with the board stayed silent, because they all knew if I could do it, so could they, and if enough people fought back, the board would lose everything. The president's face turned red. She muttered something about maintaining standards. But her voice cracked. For the first time, she looked small, and I left that meeting with something I hadn't felt in months. Power. But power never comes without a cost. That night, as I sat in my living room, I heard a noise in the garage, a soft scrape, like metal against concrete. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The garage was dark, shadows stretching across the walls, and there, in the corner, was another note, this one carved into the wood of the door itself. Rules won't save you. I froze. The fake HOA had been inside. They had come into my home, And worse, they had done it without me hearing a thing. I wanted to call the police again, but I knew the cycle. Report it. They write it down. Nothing happens. So I sat there in the garage, staring at the words until morning, and that's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was a game between two sides. The real HOA, using rules. The fake HOA, using fear. And both of them wanted me broken. My son saw the carving the next day, his hands clenched into fists. He said he wasn't afraid, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I told him to stay inside, to focus on school, to let me handle it, but he didn't listen. That night, I found him in the backyard, wearing the vest again, holding the rifle again, patrolling the fence line like a soldier on duty. I begged him to stop, told him it wasn't his fight, but he shook his head. He said if they came again, he'd be ready. And I didn't know what scared me more, the thought of the fake HOA returning, or the thought of my boy turning into something he wasn't meant to be. Days blurred together, fines slowed down, but the shadows grew heavier. Cars I didn't recognize, parked on the corner at night, mail left on my porch without stamps. Just warnings, scrawled in marker. Neighbors started avoiding me altogether. It was like the whole street decided I was cursed. And maybe I was. One night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the rulebook again, and a thought hit me so hard it made me drop the book. What if the fake HOA wasn't fake at all? What if it was the board's secret weapon, a way to scare people into paying, a way to keep the neighborhood under control without getting their own hands dirty? The rules, the fines, the threats, they all worked together too perfectly. It wasn't two enemies, it was one enemy with two faces. The realization left me cold, because if that was true, then I wasn't just fighting neighbors with clipboards, I was fighting neighbors with bats. I looked at my son asleep on the couch, his vest beside him, his hands curled into fists even in dreams, and I whispered a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I won't let them win. But how? How do you beat people who control both fear and rules? How do you fight an enemy that hides behind laws by day and shadows by night? The next HOA meeting was coming in a week. I knew I had to be ready, not just with receipts and photos, but with something bigger, something that would rip their masks off in front of everyone. I started digging, not into my garage, not into my lawn, but into their records, budgets, contracts, spending reports, the things they never wanted neighbors to see. And what I found? Well, that was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for my garage anymore. I was fighting for the truth of the whole neighborhood. I didn't know much about finances. I'm just a regular guy, work my job, pay my bills. But when I looked at those HOA records, something didn't add up. The numbers looked clean at first. Maintenance fees, landscaping, pool repairs, all the things you'd expect, but buried deeper. There were payments that had no explanation, cash withdrawals, strange security expenses, invoices from companies that didn't exist. The more I read data, the colder my stomach felt. Becketut. As those payments lined up with the nights the fake HOA had appeared, the bats in my garage, the letters taped to my door, the carved words in my wall, all of it had been paid for. By my own HOA dues. I slammed the binder shut. My hands shook with rage. They weren't just looking the other way. They were paying for the fear, funding the very men who smashed my life apart. I wanted to storm into the president's house that night, throw the papers in her face, demand answers. But I stopped myself. That's what they wanted. They wanted me emotional, reckless, easy to silence. No, I had to be smarter. I had to wait for the meeting, because if I exposed them there, in front of everyone, they couldn't hide. The days leading up to the meeting felt endless. Every time I walked outside, I felt eyes on me. Cars slowed down by my house, neighbors whispered and shook their heads, and the letters kept coming. But now, I didn't throw them away. I saved every one. Because soon, they would be evidence. My son grew restless too. He kept wearing the vest at night. Patrolling the backyard, I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He said if the grown-ups wouldn't protect us, he would, and that broke my heart more than anything, because no 13-year-old should carry that kind of weight. Finally, the night of the meeting came. The room was packed tighter than I had ever seen. Neighbors lined the walls, whispering about me, about my son. about the chaos that had swallowed our street. The board sat at the front, the president in her usual spot, her smile painted on. But her eyes, sharp as knives. They started with business as usual. Budgets, landscaping, petty violations read aloud. And then, they opened the floor for complaints. That was my moment. I stood. The room went silent. Every eye turned to me, and I carried the binder to the front table. The president tried to cut me off. Said my time was limited. But I didn't cede. I opened the binder, page after page of receipts. Photos, violation letters. I laid them out for everyone to see. And then, I pulled out the records, the unexplained payments, the security invoices, the cash withdrawals. I said the words slowly, so no one could miss them. Our dues are paying criminals. Gasps filled the room. Neighbors leaned forward. The president's smile vanished completely. She tried to interrupt, but I spoke louder. I told them about the night the fake HOA smashed my garage, the bats, the threats, the letters. I told them about the payments that lined up with those nights, and I held up the carved piece of wood from my garage door. The words burned into it like a scar. Rules won't save you. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted questions, demanded answers. The board looked trapped for the first time. Their power slipped in front of everyone. The president slammed her gavel, her voice sharp. She said I was lying, fabricating evidence, creating drama to cover my own violations. But no one believed her because the numbers spoke louder than words, and the silence of the board was louder than their denials. I thought I had won. But then, the back door of the meeting room opened, and two men walked in. Black shirts, white letters, HOA. The room went dead silent. Everyone froze. The real board didn't move. They didn't look surprised. They didn't call security. They just sat there, silent, as if this was normal. The men walked down the aisle slowly, their boots heavy against the floor, and for a moment, it felt like the whole room forgot to breathe. One of them leaned close to me, whispered so only I could hear, "You should have stayed quiet." I stared back. My hands shook. But I didn't step back. Not this time, because the neighbors were watching, and if I showed fear now, everything I had said would crumble. I turned to the room and spoke louder than I ever thought I could. "These are the men your money is paying for." Gasps again, phones lifted into the air, neighbors recording every second. The men froze, their confidence cracking as cameras pointed at them. The board shifted uncomfortably. Trapped by the light of truth, the president tried to end the meeting, tried to call it out of order. But it was too late. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. They were shouting, demanding, some even stepping toward the front. The men backed up slowly, their shirts suddenly looking cheap and fake under the bright fluorescent lights. And then, they left. Not with bats, not with threats, but with the silence of men who had lost their power. The board scrambled to recover. But the damage was done. The neighbors didn't trust them anymore. And as I walked out of that meeting, binder in my hands, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. But hope is dangerous because it makes you think the war is over when it's only beginning. That night, my phone buzzed with messages. Neighbors thanking me, neighbors calling me brave, neighbors asking for copies of the records. And for a moment, I thought maybe we had won. Maybe the board would collapse. Maybe the fake HOA would disappear. But when I stepped outside for air, there was another letter waiting on my porch. No envelope, just one line written in black. "You think this ends with a meeting?" I stared at the paper. The street was empty. The night was quiet. But the threat was louder than ever. Because now, it wasn't just about fines or threats. It was about survival. It was about who would break first. And I knew one thing for sure. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Just a single line of black ink. "You think this ends with a meeting?" But those words pressed down on me like 1,000 pounds. I crumpled it in my fist. But even when the paper was gone, the message stayed. They weren't finished. They weren't scared. And if anything, they were angrier than before. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside felt like footsteps. Every creak of the house felt like someone breaking in. I sat by the window again, watching the street, waiting for headlights that never came. And somewhere deep inside, I knew it was only a matter of time before they struck back the next morning. It began. Not with bats, not with broken glass, but with whispers. The neighbors who had cheered at the meeting now looked at me differently. Some nodded with respect, but others avoided my eyes, crossed the street when I walked by, and by the afternoon, rumors spread like wildfire. They said I had staged everything. They said my son's gun wasn't fake, that he had aimed a real weapon at neighbors. They said I was obsessed, paranoid, making up stories about fake HOAs just to get attention. It was the board's game. Turn the neighborhood against me. Make me the villain in my own story. Letters came again. Not just threats, but fines too. They claimed my lawn was overgrown, even though I cut it that morning. They claimed my fence was rotting, even though it was brand new. They claimed I was endangering the community with my behavior. The binder of proof didn't matter anymore, because this wasn't about rules now. It was about power. And power doesn't play fair. My wife begged me again to stop. She said we should sell the house, leave everything behind, start over somewhere else. But I couldn't, because running meant they won. Running meant they could do the same to someone else. Some other family who wouldn't fight back. My son overheard us arguing. He slammed his fist against the table and shouted that he wasn't afraid, that if they came again, he'd be ready. I wanted to hug him, but I wanted to cry too, because he was 13, and he shouldn't have to be ready for war in his own backyard. That night, war came to us anyway. It started with the sound of tires screeching outside. I jumped to the window. A truck stopped in front of my house. 4 men in black shirts jumped out, not just 2 this time. 4. Their boots pounded against the pavement as they stormed up my driveway. I yelled for my wife to call the police. My son grabbed the vest before I could stop him, and then the first bat hit my garage again. The sound echoed through the night, metal bending, glass shattering. Neighbors peeked through blinds, but no one came outside. No one wanted to get in the middle of it. I burst out the front door, shouted at them to stop. One of them turned and swung the bat near my head. The air cracked, and I stumbled back. Their eyes weren't cold this time. They were burning with anger, like they wanted to end me right there in my driveway. And then my son appeared beside me, vest strapped tight, rifle in his hands. He shouted louder than ever before, "Back off or I shoot." The men froze again, but this time, they didn't drop the bats. They laughed. One of them stepped closer. He said the board had my neighbors on their side now. He said no one would believe me if anything happened. He said my son would be the one in trouble. The words made my blood boil, but before I could answer, red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street. The men cursed, dropped their bats again, and ran for the truck. The police cars pulled in fast, but like before, the men were gone before the officers even got out. This time, the officers didn't just take notes. They questioned me harder, asked why my son had a gun. I explained again and again it was airsoft. It was fake. But they didn't believe me right away. They looked at me like I was the problem, like I was the danger, not the men who smashed my garage. And then, the board president showed up. She walked calmly down the street, clipboard in hand, as if nothing was wrong. She told the police she had received complaints about me, that I was unstable, that I was making wild accusations, that I was scaring the neighborhood with fake stories and weapons. The officers listened, they nodded, and in that moment, I realized the truth I had been afraid to face. The board wasn't just funding the fake HOA. They were protecting them. They were covering for them, and they were using the police to make me look like the criminal. The officers left without arresting anyone, but they gave me a warning. They said if my son pointed that rifle again, real or not, there would be consequences. When they left, the president leaned close to me, her smile sharp, her words quiet. "You can't win this. Stop before you lose more than your garage." And then she walked away, leaving me shaking in the dark. Inside the house, my wife cried. My son sat on the couch with his arms crossed, jaw tight, and I stared at the smashed garage again. The wreckage wasn't just wood and metal anymore. It was my life, my family, my neighborhood. I realized then, I couldn't fight them alone. I needed allies. I needed proof bigger than receipts and violation letters. I needed to turn the neighbors back on my side. So I started talking, not to everyone at once, but one by one, quiet conversations in driveways, whispers in backyards. I showed them the records. I showed them the threats. I showed them the carved wood from my garage door, and slowly, some of them believed me. One woman admitted she had seen men in black shirts outside her house too. Another man said he paid cash once, just to make them leave him alone. But they were scared, too scared to speak up, because they knew the board would crush them if they did. I told them we had to stand together, that if enough of us spoke up, the board couldn't silence us all. But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if I believed them myself, because every time I stepped outside, every time I saw a black shirt at the end of the street, every time another letter showed up on my porch, I wondered if I was already too deep. And then, 2 nights later, the message came clear. A rock crashed through my front window. Glass sprayed across the floor. When I picked it up, there was paper wrapped around it, one line written in red ink. Next time, it won't be a rock. I stood there in the broken glass, my hands bleeding, and I realized the war had reached its final stage. This wasn't about fines anymore. This wasn't about compliance. This was about survival. And the question that had haunted me wasn't if they would come again. It was when. And how far they would go. I didn't sleep after the rock. The paper still sat on the table, red letters glowing in my head. Next time, it won't be a rock. My wife wanted to pack bags right then. She said no fight was worth our lives. She said we could sell the house, disappear, start over. But I couldn't, because leaving meant letting them win. Leaving meant letting this street, this board, this fake HOA keep doing the same to others, and something inside me had cracked too deep to walk away now. My son sat quietly on the couch, vest beside him, rifle across his knees. He didn't speak, but his eyes told me everything. He was ready, too ready for a 13-year-old boy. I knew we couldn't wait anymore. We had to finish it, one way or another. So the next morning, I went to the neighbors, not with whispers this time, but with the rock in my hand. The red-lettered threat still wrapped around it. I held it up for everyone to see, and I told them the truth. I told them about the smashed garage, about the fake HOA, about the payments buried in the board's records, about the threats against my family, and about the rock that came through my window. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some looked away in fear, but a few, a brave few, stepped forward. They admitted they had been harassed too. Letters, threats, unexplained fines. One man even confessed he had paid cash once to men in black shirts, and the money disappeared without a trace. The board had divided us for too long, scaring us one by one, keeping us silent. But now, the fear was cracking. The neighbors started talking to each other. Whispers turned into anger, and anger turned into resolve. We planned a meeting, not the board's meeting, our own, a gathering in my backyard. Under the dim glow of porch lights, more than a dozen neighbors came. They brought letters, fines, threats they had kept hidden. Together we laid them all out, and the picture became clear. The board and the fake HOA weren't separate. They were one. The fines on paper and the bats in the night were two halves of the same weapon, and we had been victims of both. I told them we had two choices. We could run, sell our homes, scatter to new streets, or we could fight, not with violence, but with exposure, with truth. Because the one thing the board feared more than losing money was losing control. The neighbors looked at each other, some nervous, some doubtful, but enough of them nodded to make my chest feel lighter. We weren't alone anymore, the night of the next official HOA meeting. We walked in together, not one, not two, but nearly 20 of us, each carrying letters, fines, threats, proof. The board sat at the front as always, the president with her painted smile, but when she saw us file in as a group, her eyes flickered. The meeting began. But it didn't last long, because we interrupted, one by one. Neighbors stood and spoke. They told their stories. They showed their letters. They held up threats written in the same black ink. Voices trembled at first, but grew stronger with each confession. The board tried to silence us, called it lies, exaggerations, paranoia. But then I pulled out the binder again, this time thicker than before, stuffed with evidence from not just me, but everyone. The unexplained payments, the fake invoices, the threats carved into my garage door, the rock with its red-lettered warning, and the testimonies of my neighbors standing beside me. The room erupted. gasps, shouts, even tears from some who realized they weren't alone after all. Phones recorded every second. The board's denials sounded weaker and weaker against the tide of voices. And then, the door opened. The same two men in black shirts stepped in, bats hanging loosely at their sides. But this time, something was different, because instead of fear, the room filled with anger. Neighbors stood, dozens of horns lifted, and the men froze under the glare of cameras. For the first time, they weren't in control. They backed away slowly. Their confidence cracked. And when the police arrived, this time called not by me, but by 10 different neighbors at once, the men didn't escape. They were arrested right there in the hall, caught in front of everyone. The board president tried to distance herself, claimed she didn't know them, claimed it was coincidence, but the evidence was too strong. The payments, the threats, the connections, the truth was out, and she couldn't hide anymore. The board collapsed that night, not officially, not yet, but in the eyes of the neighborhood, their power was gone. The neighbors turned their backs on them. Voices rose demanding resignation, demanding new elections, demanding justice. I walked out of that meeting with my son beside me. The night air felt different, for the first time in months. Lighter, like the weight pressing on my chest had finally lifted. But even then, I knew it wasn't over, because power like that doesn't vanish in one night. There would be fallout. There would be consequences. But at least now, we weren't fighting alone. The days that followed were strange. News spread through the whole neighborhood. Some praised us, called us heroes. Others whispered still, afraid of what might come next. But the board stopped sending letters, the fines stopped, and for the first time in a long time, the street was quiet. One evening, I stood in front of my garage, the glass still broken, the metal still bent. But instead of despair, I felt pride, because that wreckage wasn't just damage anymore. It was proof. Proof that we had survived. My son stood beside me, vest hanging loose now, rifle left inside. He looked older than 13, older than I wanted him to be. But his eyes weren't filled with fear anymore. They were filled with something else, strength. I put my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "We're not done yet, but we're stronger now." And in that moment, I believed it, because the truth was out. The board was crumbling, the fake HOA was exposed, and the neighborhood finally stood together. But even as I breathed easier, I couldn't forget the last words carved into my garage. Rules won't save you. Because maybe the rules hadn't saved us, but courage had. And sometimes, courage is the only rule that matters.